Again in studio, this time about different forms of philosophy, but also simple forms of naming together with the code. Of course, there is also public policy for any micro and design and should not make any harm or any harm in science. To know that, it's very important to know simple forms of the methods and the ethics, together with the public and the policy about that design. There is actually the philosophy and psychology next to design, and of course also the purpose. It's very strange to understand the history of science, but also very important to understand the simple forms of the man's science and the world. Probably geometry is also important, but also very complex to analyze anything. If you are building a better and better philosophy, because sometimes all those logical things do not improve anything. The better coding is not simple, because the coding sometimes also destroys some parts of the logic, and it's very important to build better principles in life and better proportions if you are modeling. Of course, coding can be very complex and can build the complex shape also together with picture. And every coder should be very skeptical about what is still ethical. That is very important. If you are building a better software, it is very important to use Java microends. It is some sort of the religion in world, but also some sort of very difficult if you try to imagine all that because it's a lot of coincidence inside and it have different meanings. The evolution of course do not have any meaning, especially not with science, and you need to develop your own taste of language, but also building any app without taste if you want to build a better philosophy, especially if you want to lead anything or yourself. Actually, to lead yourself is actually the most important, also for the people that are working. And there are also different forms of abstraction, what it means, the knowledge on inside or outside. It's very important also to build some sort of similarity with ethical code. But the similarity can also be very dangerous if you're trying to copy anyone. So you must have your own philosophy. The philosophy is actually very important, but there are the philosophy about the climate change, the philosophy about the superheroes in life, the philosophy about how all the bills become zero, the philosophy about how you could buy anything without money, the philosophy about better and better Bitcoin systems or crypto, as explained in my book. Crystal also have that crystallizing forum design. The community, actually, it's not simple. It is very difficult to understand simple forms of the logic together with the code. And of course, if the logic is making any sense, if there is no sense in the logic, the code, the logic, and everything human know, it become unlogical and a poison. And of course, some people are also showing that to lead logic is unreal, and to understand simple forms of logic sometimes is very difficult. The logic also have different forms of symbols, and to be more and more unique is actually very difficult. There are, of course, also different forms of photo stocks and different forms of the values. To understand the platforms related to photos, you must have some psychology about that. It's not easy to understand simple forms of simple computers also and what that means. To understand better code sometimes is very difficult. A lot of people is using JavaScript and they think they invented the whole world, but it's actually very important to understand simple forms of the code. Coding is not as simple as people think. And of course, some people also think that code is only in our computers or only on apps, but of course, the code could be anywhere. What if you could code the perfect designs of humans? What if you could code the better shape of brand or different forms of the structure, how your company actually behave? There are different forms of the symbols together with the microends that are actually quite important, but also look to be elegant. The elegance actually show if that's appropriate next to the fashion, but it's very important to understand simple coding and the simple coding in every area in the world. Of course, the world includes a lot of poverty and a lot of problems, but it's some sort of DNA of the simple company that is gaining simple forums. Not easy to understand simple language in English, especially if you are building some sort of very, very advanced movie or different forms of the effects, especially in studio. The meaning of different forms of experience, of course, are different forms of information people see in their life. Do not mess these together with different forms of the light. Different forms of the language are also, of course, part of the code, and there are different displacement that people have that when they are communicating with each other. So it's very important to have some sort of the feelings also. It's very important to build different forms of simple signs and different meanings. There is very, very difficult to build a better computer science because the computer science is actually very, very theoretical. To build a better programming language is some sort of science, but also some sort of geometry. The geometry is actually some sort of processing different forms of visions, but those do not mean anything if you cannot achieve not even 1% of that. The grocery in microends is quite simple, but sometimes very difficult in different forms of the network, especially for people that are on. Well, microends actually is building also blockchains. The blockchains are also quite difficult and related to different applications. Of course, everything comes from the software. The software is very simple, but sometimes also related to build a better cryptocurrency. For example, one of the blockchains they built, it was the Libra. It's actually very, very difficult concurrency system, and it includes a lot of digital currencies. Of course, it's very difficult to build simple forms of the blockchain technology, especially if you're doing that with any type of distributed systems. There are also different forms of the banking that continues together with other institutions, sometimes also with micro ends. But it's also very important to serve the charity. That means the world, and for me, the world is some sort of Africa. In Africa, it's very important that you support the poor. If you do not support the poor, then of course you could not lead anything. Every picture, every photo and design your company is making, of course, is making the world much richer. And probably you'll be very miserable if you are going to become very wealthy. But it's very important also to vote for different forms of the ledgers on this content. There are also different forms of simple hyperledgers actually used in IBM, but also Intel have quite interesting chips that is building. Something in Intel is actually quite difficult because it comes from Silicon Valley, and this one is actually quite difficult. There are also a lot of chips that are made from Dell, and Microends use that a lot. In microends, of course, the teams also use Intel, and that is not simple stock. Very important to understand the primary simple forms of the simple commercial processors, but also the chips. To understand simple organization of that, of course, there also must be a lot of security. It is very important to build a better Intel, but also different forms of the gate for that type of the forum. Manufacturing millions of Intel chips is actually not very difficult, but of course, you must do something good for people if you want more of those chips. On the different forms of the psychosystems are also different forms of Intel together to build a better bank system It's not easy to understand any forums of the apps, but also not any forums of the capital on the marketplaces. There are different forms of programs that can, of course, support you together with the image of the code to make a better contribution to any city, but also, of course, the better contribution to engineering together with farming if you want a better company. It is not easy to understand different forms of opportunity, but sometimes opportunity do not mean anything if you don't understand the Silicon 5 great company. Software is becoming more and more difficult from month to month. And of course, it's not easy to build those logos and share it with humans. Sometimes it's very important to understand humans, but it's also very, very hard to understand technology. The technology is not simple part of network.